You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Let's go back to the year 1666, from Sunday, September 2nd to Thursday, September 6th, when the Great Fire of London tore through the heart of the city. This massive blaze started off in the middle of the night in a bakery on Pudding Lane, quickly getting out of control. It destroyed most of the city enclosed by the old Roman wall, as well as spreading into other areas. Now, most people believe that not many lives were lost in the fire, but some historians think the reality might be different. As the flames spread on that Sunday night, the main strategy to stop it was to create gaps by pulling down buildings. But there was a problem. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, couldn't decide what to do. Eventually, the fire grew into a raging inferno, and by that time, even when they started tearing down buildings, it was too difficult to control. By Monday, the fire had made its way to the heart of the city. Rumors started spreading that foreigners were to blame, which led to panic and violence on the streets, especially against the French and Dutch, who were England's enemies in an ongoing war at that time. By Tuesday, the fire had consumed almost the entire city, including St. Paul's Cathedral, and it even posed a threat to King Charles II's residence. It was a true crisis, but the situation started to look up when the strong winds calmed down and the firefighters used gunpowder to create effective gaps to stop the flames from spreading further towards the east. The aftermath of the fire was daunting. London faced severe social and economic challenges. King Charles II actually encouraged people to move away from the city, fearing a potential uprising from those who lost their homes. There were all kinds of ideas about how to rebuild London, some quite bold. In the end, though, the city was rebuilt following the same old medieval pattern of streets, which you can still see if you walk around London today. In the 1660s, London was not just the biggest city in Britain, it was the third biggest in the Western world, with a population between 300,000 and 400,000 people. When John Evelyn compared London with the splendid Paris in 1659, he referred to it as a wooden, northern and unartificial congestion of houses. By unartificial, what Evelyn was really saying is that London seemed unplanned and haphazard, like it had just grown naturally without any real organization. For 400 years, London had been bustling within its Roman-built walls, and it had gotten pretty packed. Plus, it had expanded beyond those walls into areas like Shoreditch, Holborn and Southwark. By the end of the 1600s, the city proper, the part within the city walls and next to the Thames, was just a slice of the larger London, covering around 700 acres with about 80,000 people, or a quarter of the city's population. But beyond the city walls, most Londoners lived in crowded suburbs. Within the city, it was all about business. Being the commercial heart of London, it was the biggest market and the busiest port in England. However, the tight, bustling streets also meant the city was jammed with traffic, dirty and pretty unhealthy, a situation made worse by the terrible outbreak of bubonic plague in 1665. Relations between the City of London and the English Crown were a bit rocky. The city was a hub of Republican sentiment during the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651, and it still had the power to unsettle King Charles II, which was evident from the Republican uprisings that occurred in London in the early 1660s. The city's leaders were from the Civil War generation. They remembered King Charles I's attempts to take complete control, which led to significant national strife. They were set on preventing Charles II from following in his father's footsteps. So when the Great Fire threatened the city, they turned down Charles's offer of military help, not wanting his unpopular troops in the city. By the time Charles took charge from the inefficient Lord Mayor, the fire was already beyond anyone's control. The city's layout resembled a medieval maze with its tight, twisty, stone-paved paths. It had dealt with significant fires before, and one had recently occurred in 1633. People were not supposed to build with wood or use straw for roofs for a lengthy period, but since it was more cost-effective, they continued to do so. The more upscale part of town, where the affluent traders resided, was primarily constructed of brick or stone. This area had ample space, yet directly outside of it was densely packed with residences crammed into every available spot to accommodate the booming population. These houses were tightly packed together, and their architecture increased the risk of fire. In London, homes would often have upper floors that overhung the street. While the ground floors were modest in size, the upper floors expanded and extended outward, almost touching the houses across the street. An observer mentioned that this architectural feature not only facilitated the rapid spread of fires, but also made them difficult to extinguish. In 1661, Charles II instructed people to cease constructing homes that overhung the street, but there was little change. Later, in 1665, he more distinctly pointed out the dangers of the narrow streets in the event of a fire and stated that builders who did not comply with regulations could be imprisoned and hazardous buildings might be demolished. Yet, this had little impact on the situation. The zone adjacent to the River Thames proved vital when the Great Fire erupted. The river was a paramount source of water for combating the fires and a route for people to flee via boat. However, the impoverished neighborhoods along the river were saturated with combustible materials. These areas were congested with unstable wooden structures and sheds coated in tar paper, surrounded by flammable substances like tar, pitch, hemp, rosin, and flax. The city was also stocked with gunpowder, predominantly stored along the river, where ship suppliers kept it in barrels. A considerable quantity of gunpowder, approximately 500 to 600 tons, was housed in the Tower of London, remnants from the English Civil War. The substantial Roman wall encircling the city made evacuation from the fire challenging, with only 8 narrow gateways available. Initially, most individuals did not consider leaving the city. They merely sought to transfer their possessions to safer locations, at times multiple relocations in a single day. It was not until late on Monday that the realization dawned on people that they needed to surpass the walls. By that time, the gates were congested with frightened individuals endeavoring to exit with all their belongings, carts, horses, and wagons. One of the prominent difficulties for those attempting to quell the fire was the narrowness of the streets. Typically, these slender alleys were already intricate to navigate due to the volume of carts, wagons, and pedestrians. However, with the additional pressure of individuals trying to escape the fires and soldiers working to pave the way for firefighters, the conditions became even more disorderly and terrifying. In the past, fires were a significant problem in cities filled with wooden buildings and objects that could easily ignite, such as hearths, candles, and ovens. There were individuals known as bellmen who would patrol the city at night, looking out for fires as part of their duties. When a fire occurred, the community members knew the protocol and often managed to keep it under control. If a severe fire erupted, its presence would become widely known due to the church bells, which would ring distinctively, prompting people to rush to assist in extinguishing it. 2 principal methods were employed to combat these fires. Initially, every church in the vicinity was mandated to possess specific tools: extended ladders, leather buckets, axes, and fire hooks. The latter were utilized to demolish buildings to prevent the spread of fire. Surprisingly, gunpowder was also sometimes used to intentionally destroy buildings, creating a gap that the fire could not cross. Historians believe that this strategy, coupled with a reduction in wind speed, played a crucial role in resolving some extremely intense fires. Demolishing buildings before the fire reached them proved highly effective. However, during a notorious fire, implementation of these measures was postponed because the Lord Mayor failed to take decisive action when necessary. Water served as another line of defense against fires, and this city boasted a robust infrastructure featuring wooden pipes that supplied water to thousands of residences from both the river and a spring. In theory, one could access these pipes in the vicinity of a fire, connect a hose, and commence spraying or filling buckets. Moreover, the origin of one devastating fire was in close proximity to the river, which should have facilitated the formation of a bucket brigade to transport water directly to the flames. Contrarily, the populace succumbed to panic and fled, resulting in the fire spreading to the riverfront and destroying the water-pumping equipment. The city had also invested in sophisticated fire engines that somewhat resembled the expansive pumps used in modern times. However, these engines were not as effective as envisioned. Some were devoid of wheels and stationed on sleds, hence they had to be towed to the scene, typically arriving tardily and lacking efficiency. During this particular incident, there were indeed attempts to utilize these engines, with individuals dragging them through the streets to draw water from the river. Nevertheless, the efforts were chaotic. Some engines plummeted into the Thames, and those that remained intact were unable to approach the blaze due to the extreme heat. In the early hours of a Sunday on 2nd September, a fire started at Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. Farriner's family escaped the blaze by moving from an upstairs window to the house next door, but tragically, their maidservant, who was too scared to follow, died. She was the fire's first victim. As neighbors attempted to extinguish the fire, the local constables arrived about an hour into the incident. They believed the best action was to tear down the neighboring buildings to stop the fire from spreading. However, the homeowners resisted this idea, and eventually they called on Lord Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth to make the decision. By the time Bloodworth got there, the flames had spread to nearby houses and were moving towards the warehouses filled with flammable materials along the river. Experienced firemen urged for demolition, but Bloodworth, who was criticized for being more of a yes man than a competent leader, rejected the idea, arguing that the building owners couldn't be found since many properties were leased. Overwhelmed by the crisis, Bloodworth infamously remarked, "A woman could urinate it out," and then he left the scene. Historian Jacob Field later noted that while Bloodworth was often blamed for not acting swiftly to contain the fire, there wasn't much he could have realistically done given the firefighting capabilities of the time and the complex societal dynamics involved in fire prevention measures. Samuel Pepys, who climbed the Tower of London that Sunday morning, wrote in his diary about the ferocity of the fire, which had destroyed around 300 homes and had reached the river. He described scenes of chaos along Pudding Lane, with people frantically trying to salvage their possessions. When Pepys reported the disaster to King Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York, they were deeply concerned. The King commanded Pepys to instruct the Lord Mayor to demolish any houses necessary to halt the fire's spread. The Duke of York even offered the services of the Royal Life Guards. Despite these efforts, the fire, fueled by strong winds, was out of control by mid-morning, and people had no choice but to flee. The streets became clogged with the mass of evacuating people and their belongings, making it impossible for firemen to get through. Pepys eventually returned to the city on foot after abandoning his coach. He found Bloodworth overwhelmed amidst the firefighting attempts and received a despondent reply from the Lord Mayor regarding the King's orders, as the fire was spreading quicker than they could demolish buildings. King Charles II himself took his barge down the river to the fire and boldly took charge, commanding that buildings be pulled down to create fire breaks, which Bloodworth had failed to ensure. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had turned into an intense firestorm, creating its own climate. Powerful winds were drawn in at ground level, feeding the flames, which swept through the city in a shape like an archer's bow. By that evening, London faced the most devastating fire in recent memory, spreading 1,600 feet westward along the river. On Monday, the fire continued to ravage London, moving westward and northward. The river acted as a barrier to its southern spread, but it had already destroyed homes on London Bridge and seemed ready to leap across and reach Southwark on the other side of the Thames. The bridge had been a known hazard since a fire in 1633, yet a gap between buildings helped prevent Southwark from catching fire this time. The fire reached the city's financial district by Monday afternoon. Homes on Lombard Street, where many bankers lived, started burning, and there was a frantic effort to save gold coins from melting. The sense of desperation among Londoners was palpable, and they appeared overwhelmed by the flames, now threatening areas known for wealth and commerce like the Royal Exchange and the shops in Cheapside. By the end of the afternoon, the once bustling Royal Exchange was reduced to a smoking ruin. John Evelyn, a diarist who lived just outside of the city, remarked on the sense of shock and inaction among the people, with widespread panic preventing them from saving their belongings as they fled in disarray. By the time Evelyn got to Southwark on Monday, he saw a much worse scene than the day before. The city was ablaze from the bridge all the way to the upscale Cheapside. He noted the river jammed with barges and boats loaded with goods, and witnessed an exodus of people and carts squeezing through the city gates, heading for open fields to pitch tents and protect what few possessions they could. Theories spread that the fire was no accident, with foreigners quickly blamed due to the ongoing war with the Dutch. Tales of intentional arson by spies and rumors of an approaching invasion fueled a contagion of fear. This panic was exacerbated by the loss of the General Letter Office, disrupting communications, and the near miss of the London Gazette's printing office. The desperate rush to evacuate belongings from the city proved lucrative for the lower classes, who found work transporting items with the cost for hiring a cart skyrocketing to an astronomical sum equivalent to about £133,000 in today's money. This resulted in chaos at the city gates, leading magistrates to briefly close them in hopes that people would turn their focus to extinguishing the fire instead of rescuing their possessions. In response to the crisis and the apparent absence of the Lord Mayor, the King's brother James, Duke of York, took charge. He established command centres, organised demolitions to prevent the fire from spreading, and kept the peace on the streets. The situation worsened by Monday evening. It was hoped that Baynard's Castle, a substantial stone building, would hold back the fire, but to the city's dismay, it too was engulfed in flames and burned throughout the night. On Tuesday, September 4th, there was a tremendous amount of destruction. The Duke of York had set up a critical control point at Temple Bar, right where Strand connects with Fleet Street. This spot was supposed to be key in preventing the fire from spreading west toward the Palace of Whitehall. The Duke and his team of firefighters were counting on the River Fleet to act as a natural barrier. They positioned themselves from the Fleet Bridge all the way down to the Thames, ready to tackle the blaze. But as Tuesday morning rolled in, the relentless easterly wind blew the flames across the Fleet River, catching them off guard and forcing the firefighters to flee. By the time mid-morning came around, the fire had made its way to the upscale shopping district of Cheapside. Despite creating a substantial gap to halt the fire northward, James's team of firefighters found their efforts undermined as the firebreak was breached repeatedly. The fire continued to push eastward from Pudding Lane, defying the east wind, and it threatened the Tower of London, noted for its stores of gunpowder. With no assistance arriving from the official firemen, who were preoccupied on the Western Front, the Tower's garrison took action. They resorted to blowing up surrounding houses to create their own firebreaks, which thankfully stopped the fire from advancing. St. Paul's Cathedral was believed to be safe, with its thick stone walls and an open plaza serving as a natural buffer. It was packed with valuables that had been saved from the flames, and its underground area was stuffed with the inventories of nearby printers and booksellers. However, the start of the trouble was the wooden scaffolding cladding the cathedral, the result of Christopher Wren's ongoing restoration work. When the scaffolding caught fire that Tuesday night, it did not take long, a mere 30 minutes, for the lead roofing to melt, igniting the books and papers stored below. Before long, the cathedral was in ruins. On Tuesday evening, the winds calmed down and the barriers that the soldiers made finally showed their effect on Wednesday, the 5th of September. When Pepys climbed up to the top of Barking Church, he looked out over the city and described it as the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw, while seeing the destruction for himself. Although there were still numerous smaller fires burning, the major catastrophe had passed. However, it wasn't completely over. Coal continued to smoulder in cellars even 2 months later. Close to the city, in the large open space of Moorfields, there was a vast camp of people who had lost their homes. Evelyn was stunned to see how many people were in need, living under tents or in shoddily built huts with hardly anything to their name, let alone the basics for living. Desperate people stayed nearby, hoping to retrieve anything they might from what remained of their homes. With tensions rising to a boiling point, there was a real concern that the people of London might rebel against the monarchy. Since food supply lines had been cut, King Charles declared that bread would be brought into the city daily, and markets would be set up around the city's edge. The atmosphere among those who had been through the fire was one of terror, with continued high suspicions of foreigners and fears of an invasion by the French and Dutch. Panic ensued on Wednesday night in the camps at Parliament Hill, Moorfields and Islington. A light seen in the sky above Fleet Street drove fears that 50,000 French and Dutch immigrants were coming to commit violent acts. People took to the streets, lashing out at foreigners they came across, but troops and royal guards managed to push the crowd back. As it turned out, the light was from a new fire near Inner Temple, which suffered considerable damage despite efforts to control the fire, including trying to stop its spread by blowing up the paper house. When it comes to the tragic fire, official records suggest only a small number of people died, which is commonly believed to be fewer than 10. Porter mentions a death toll of 8, and Tinniswood agrees it's in the single digits. However, Tinniswood points out that some deaths likely went unrecorded, including those in makeshift camps who didn't perish directly from the fire, but from the conditions afterward. Field contends that while the death count may exceed the usual figure of 6, it probably didn't reach into the hundreds. He cites the London Gazette, which didn't report any deaths, and argues that a higher death toll would have shown up in petitions for aid or critical writings of the time. In contrast, Hanson questions the low death figures, noting the harsh winter conditions that survivors faced living in temporary shelters or amongst the ruins, which led to additional deaths from hunger and exposure, like what happened to the playwright James Shirley and his spouse. Hanson also finds it hard to believe that the only victims were the ones rescued by the Duke of York, pointing out that the fire's intensity could have completely consumed bodies, suggesting a potential death toll in the hundreds, if not thousands. The destruction caused by the fire is immense, between 13,200 and 13,500 homes, up to 87 churches, 44 company halls, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, and even St. Paul's Cathedral were lost. The list goes on, including the Bridewell Palace, various city prisons, the General Letter Office and city gates like Ludgate, Newgate and Aldersgate. Financially, the losses were staggering, around £9 to £10 million back then, which is about £1.79 billion today. François Colsoni points out that the value of books lost alone reached £150,000. Evelyn observed the dire aftermath, where up to 200,000 displaced people of all walks of life were scattered, lying in the fields with whatever they could rescue, toward Islington and Highgate. The fire wiped out roughly 15% of the city's housing stock. After the Great Fire had wreaked havoc, the city's leaders, known as the Court of Aldermen, got straight to work to clean up the rubble and get food back on the shelves. By the following Saturday, markets were bustling again, providing food for the people gathered at Moorfields. King Charles II wasted no time in urging those who had lost their homes to move out of London and make a new start elsewhere. He made it clear, saying everyone should welcome these unfortunate individuals and allow them to practice their trades without any fuss. To keep everyone calm, the king also ordered that no one should spread frightening rumours and started a national donation drive to help those affected by the fire. The official word, as reported by the London Gazette, was that the fire was just a terrible accident. This account emphasised that a twist of fate caused the flames, but the king played a big part in bringing them under control. Yet the city's people were quick to point fingers, especially at foreigners like Catholics, the French and the Dutch, leading to arrests across the country. A sad example was a man named Robert Hubert, a French watchmaker not altogether in his right mind, who at first said he was with a group that started a fire in Westminster. Then he switched his story, claiming he was the one who lit the blaze at a bakery on Pudding Lane. Even though his confession was iffy, he was found guilty and executed on October 29, 1666. Not long after, it turned out he couldn't have started the fire since he was at sea when it all began. To get to the bottom of how the Great Fire started, Sir Robert Brooke led a committee that heard many theories about a plot by foreigners and Catholics to burn down the city. A report was put together and sent to Parliament, with rumours that Hubert and other Catholic conspirators were to blame. Overseas, the Dutch saw the fire as payback for the English burning down one of their towns, while in Italy, pamphlets spread saying London's downfall was like Lucifer's fall from grace. In Spain, people saw it as a lesson in Protestant wrongdoing. Meanwhile, in France, on the 5th of October, Marc Antonio Justinian, the Venetian ambassador, reported to the Doge of Venice and the Senate that King Louis XIV wasn't going to celebrate this sad event that brought misery to so many. Even though Louis XIV offered to send food and supplies to help London through his aunt, Queen Henrietta Maria, he was no fool to the opportunities the fire presented. He knew it made his ships safer from English attacks when crossing the Channel. That said, when Louis XIV tried to take advantage of the situation, his combined French and Dutch naval forces were defeated by a larger English fleet, led by Thomas Allen at the Battle of Dungeness on September 17th. In response to the massive destruction brought on by the Great Fire of London, a fire court operated from February 1667 until December 1668, and once more from 1670 to February 1676. Authorised by specific Acts of Parliament, this court quickly settled debates between tenants and landlords regarding who was responsible for rebuilding, and it all hinged on who could afford it. Typically, decisions were reached within a single day. If it weren't for the fire court, long legal battles would have further delayed London's urgent reconstruction. Many visionary architects, including Wren and Evelyn, did not waste time and sent in ambitious ideas for remaking the city. Figures like Robert Hooke, Valentine Knight, and Richard Newcourt also submitted plans, all embracing grid systems, which would later become widespread in American cities. Had London been redeveloped according to some of these proposals, it could have stood shoulder to shoulder with Paris in grandeur. Archaeologist John Schofield remarked that Wren's design could have led to a very organized division of social classes, somewhat like what Haussmann did in Paris about 200 years later. But Wren's ideas brought with them a tricky issue. Property boundaries needed to be precisely defined. Efforts by both the Crown and the city to work out how to reimburse people affected by these grand plans ultimately fell through. Even the simple act of calling back workmen to measure the grounds of the previous buildings didn't take off. Many were more focused on immediate survival, whereas others had left the city altogether. Plus, labor was scarce following the fire, making it extremely difficult to find workers. In the end, London resurrected much of its former street layout. This process, according to Michael Hebert, even spurred advancements in survey techniques and map-making, specifically in the creation of iconographical or detailed overhead view maps. When the city was rebuilt, they included better fire safety measures and hygiene improvements, such as broader streets, unobstructed access to the River Thames, and the use of fire-resistant materials like brick and stone in construction. The Rebuilding of London Act of 1666 made these standards official by prohibiting wooden exteriors and standardized the cost of materials and wages for workers while setting a 3-year rebuilding deadline. After that, any unsold land could be sold. They even put a tax on coal to help pay for these public works. The reconstruction of private property largely wrapped up by 1671, and the city saw the emergence of new public structures like St. Paul's Cathedral and Christopher Wren's 51 new churches.
Separately, the entrepreneur Nicholas Barbon was a bit of a rule breaker. He pushed ahead with his own development projects, transforming areas like the Strand, St. Giles, Bloomsbury and Holborn, contrary to the law, which prohibited building between the City of London and Westminster.
The Great Fire of London did not just change the city's landscape, it also hugely affected its population, its society, politics, economics, and culture. The fire led to what was, until the Blitz, the largest upheaval in where people lived throughout London's history. More people moved to areas west of London, but the surrounding suburbs also became more densely populated. Out of the over 13,000 homes lost to the fire, about 9,000 new ones were built, and by 1974, many were still empty. Those who stayed in the city paid less for their homes. Business suffered tremendously because shops, supplies, and money were gone. It took a while for the economy to rebound. The City of London Corporation, which is like the city's government, had to borrow a lot of money for rebuilding, and ended up not being able to pay it back by 1983. As a result, King Charles took away some of their powers. Even though the commercial areas had lots of empty spaces as merchants moved away, London remained economically important, thanks to its shipping routes and central role in England's political and cultural scene. According to historian Jacob Field, the fire also brought out England's deep-seated mistrust of Catholics, especially during times of trouble. Some people used rumours that Catholics were to blame for the fire as political ammunition against King Charles II, who was seen as too friendly toward Catholics. This happened mostly during events known as the Popish Plot and the Exclusion Crisis. Royalists who were supporters of the king said that the fire was just an accident, while the Whigs, who were not so keen on the king, doubted the loyalty of the Catholics, especially the Duke of York. New rules came into play in 1967 to help prevent future fires or at least make them easier to put out in London. This disaster sparked the creation of insurance companies, like Nicholas Barbon's fire office, and they had their own fire teams, with better deals for clients who built safer, brick houses rather than wooden ones. The insurance company's private firefighting efforts eventually merged into what we know as the London Fire Brigade today. Building codes also began to focus on stopping fires from spreading from one place to another. Some people think that the fire may have stopped the bubonic plague by destroying the dirty housing and the rats and fleas that helped spread it. London didn't have any plague outbreaks after the fire, and during a later plague in Bombay, they copied this idea by burning down buildings. However, experts like those at the Museum of London question that idea. King Charles had a monument built near where the fire started, designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. It's over 202 feet tall. In 1981, it had an inscription blaming Catholics for the fire, which reflected the tensions at that time. This inscription was only removed in 1830, after Catholic rites changed in the United Kingdom. There's also the Golden Boy of Pye Corner, marking where the fire stopped. Interestingly, Christopher Wren had a big plan to rebuild London, but it was never used. It did, however, influence a lot when it came to city planning and was even part of textbooks on the subject. It was brought up again when discussing rebuilding after World War II. In 2016, there was even a postage stamp featuring Wren's plan as part of the 350th anniversary remembrances of the Great Fire. The fire also inspired creatives back in the day like poets. Poetry was big in the 17th century, and at least 23 poems about the fire were published right after it happened. The event has continued to be portrayed in culture, including in a novel from 1841 called Old St. Paul's, a 1914 film, a 2006 novel Forged in the Fire, a 2014 TV drama The Great Fire, and a musical named Bumble Scratch, performed for the fire's 350th anniversary